5. Late on the 6th day following his departure from Butcher's Crossing, Miller returned. In his room, Andrews heard shouts on the street below him and heard the thump of heavy feet. Above these sounds, muffled by the distance, came the crack of a whip and the deep-throated howl of a driver. Andrews came to his feet and strode to the window. He leaned out over the ledge and looked toward the eastern approach to the town. A great cloud of dust hung upon the air, moved forward, and dissipated itself in its forward movement. Out of the dust plodded a long line of oxen. The heads of the lead team were thrust downward, and the two beasts towed in toward each other, so that occasionally their long, curving horns clashed, causing both beasts to shake their heads and snort, and separate for a few moments. Until the team got very near the town, the lead oxen passing Joe Long's barber shop, the wagon was scarcely visible to the townspeople who stood about the sidewalks, and to Will Andrews, who waited above them. The wagon was long and shallow, and it curved downward toward the center so that it gave the fleeting appearance of a flat-bottomed boat supported by massive wheels. Faded blue paint flecked the sides of the wagon, and the vestiges of red paint could be seen on the slow-turning spokes near the centers of the scarred, massive wheels. A heavy man in a check shirt sat high and erect on a wagon box seat clipped near the front. In his right hand was a long bullwhip which he cracked above the ears of the lead team. His left hand pulled heavily against an upright handbrake so that the oxen, which moved forward under his whip, were restrained by the heavy weight of the wagon above its half-locked wheels. Beside the wagon, slouched in his saddle, Miller rode a black horse. He led another, a sorrel, which was saddled but riderless. The procession passed the hotel and past Jackson's saloon. Andrews watched it go beyond the livery stable, beyond the blacksmith shop, and out of town. He watched until he could see little but the moving cloud of dust made brilliant and impenetrable by the light of the falling sun, and he waited until the dust cloud stopped and thinned away down in the hollow of the river. Then he went back to his bed and lay upon it, his palms folded beneath the back of his head, and stared up at the ceiling. He was still staring at the ceiling, at the random flickerings of light upon it, an hour later, when Charlie Hodge knocked at his door and entered without waiting for a reply. He paused just inside the room. His figure was shadowy and vague, enlarged by the dim light that came from the hall. "What are you laying here in the dark for?" he asked. "Waiting for you to come up and get me," Andrews said. He lifted his legs over the side of the bed and sat upright on its edge. "I'll light the lamp," Charlie Hodge said. He moved forward in the darkness. "Where is it?" "On the table near the window." He pulled a match across the wall beside the window. The match flared yellow. With the hand that held the match, he lifted the smoked chimney from the lamp, set it down on the table, touched the match to the wick, and replaced the chimney. The room brightened as the wick's burning grew steadier, and the flickerings from the out-of-doors were submerged. Charlie Hodge dropped the burnt match to the floor. "I guess you know Miller's back in town?" Andrews nodded. "I saw the wagon as it came past." "Who was with him?" "Fred Schneider," Charlie Hodge said. "He's gonna be our skinner. Miller's worked with him before." Andrews nodded again. "I suppose Miller got everything he needed." "Everything's ready," Charlie Hodge said. "Miller and Schneider are at Jackson's. Miller wants you to come over so we can get everything settled." "All right," Andrews said. "I'll get my coat." "Your coat?" Charlie Hodge asked. "Boy, if you're cold now, what are you going to do when we get up in the mountains?" Andrews smiled. "I'm not cold. I'm just in the habit of wearing it." "A man loses lots of habits in time," Charlie Hodge said. "Come on, let's go." The two men left the room and went down the stairs. Charlie Hodge went a few steps in front of Andrews, who had to hurry to keep up with him. He walked with quick, nervous strides, and his thin, drawn-in shoulders jerked upward with his steps. Miller and Schneider were waiting at the long, narrow bar at Jackson's. They stood at the bar with glasses of beer in front of them. A light mantle of dust clung about the shoulders of Schneider's red check shirt, and the ends of his straight, bristling brown hair, visible beneath a flat-brimmed hat, were caked white with trail dust. The two men turned as Charlie Hodge and Will Andrews came down the room toward them. Miller's flat, thin lips curved upward in a tight smile. A precise swathe of black beard shadowed the heavy lower half of his face. "Will," he said softly, "did you think I wasn't coming back?" Andrews smiled. "No, I knew you'd be back." "Will, this is Fred Schneider. He's our Skinner." Andrews extended his hand, and Schneider took it. Schneider's hand clasp was loose, indifferent. He shook Andrews' hand once with a quick pumping motion. "How do?" he said. His face was round, and though the lower part was covered with a light brown stubble, the whole face gave the appearance of being smooth and featureless. His eyes were wide and blue, and they regarded Andrews from beneath heavy, sleepy lids. He was a man of medium height, thickly built. He gave the immediate impression of being at all times watchful, alert, and on his guard. He wore a small pistol in a black leather holster hung high on his waist. Miller drained the last of his beer from his glass. "Let's go in the big room where we can sit down," he said, wiping a bit of foam from his lips with a forefinger. The others nodded. Schneider stood aside and waited for them to pass through the side door. Then he followed, closing the door carefully behind them. The group of 4 men, with Miller in the lead, went toward the back of the room. They took a table near the stairs. Schneider sat with his back to the stairs, facing the room. Andrews sat in front of him. Charlie Hodge was at Andrews' left, and Miller was at his right. Miller said, "On my way back from the river, I stopped in and saw MacDonald. He'll buy our hides from us. That'll save us packing to Ellsworth." "How much will he pay?" asked Schneider. $4 apiece for prime hides," Miller said. "He's got a buyer for prime hides back east." Schneider shook his head. "How much for summer hides? You won't find any prime skins for another 3 months." Miller turned to Andrews. "I haven't made any arrangements with Schneider, and I haven't told him where we're going. I thought I ought to wait till we all got together." Andrews nodded. "All right," he said. "Let's have a drink while we talk," Miller said. "Charlie, see if you can find somebody to bring us back a pitcher of beer and some whiskey." Charlie Hodge scraped his chair back on the floor and went swiftly across the room. "Did you make out all right at Ellsworth?" Andrews asked. Miller nodded. "Got a good buy on the wagon. Some of the oxen haven't been broken in, and a couple of them need to be shod, but the lead team is a good one, and the rest of them will be broken in after the first few days." "Did you have enough money?" Miller nodded again indifferently. "Got a little left over, even. I found you a nice horse. I rode it all the way back. All we need to pick up here is some whiskey for Charlie, a few sides of bacon, and do you have any rough clothes?" "I can pick some up tomorrow," Andrews said. "I'll tell you what you need." Schneider looked sleepily at the 2 men. "Where are we going?" Charlie Hodge came across the room behind him, carrying a tray with a pitcher, bottle, and glasses upon it. Francine weaved among the tables. Charlie Hodge sat down, and Francine put the bottle of whiskey and the pitcher of beer in the center of the table and put the glasses in front of the men. She smiled at Andrews and turned to Miller. "Did you bring me what I asked for from Ellsworth?" "Yep," Miller said. "I'll give it to you later. You sit at another table for a while, Francine. We got business to talk over." Francine nodded and walked to a table where another girl and a man was sitting. Andrews watched her until she sat down. When he turned, he saw that Schneider's eyes were still upon her. Schneider blinked slowly once and turned his eyes to Andrews. Andrews looked away. All of the men except Charlie Hodge filled their glasses with beer. He took the bottle of whiskey before him, uncorked it, and let the pale amber liquor gurgle into his glass nearly to the brim. "Where are we going?" Schneider asked again. Miller set his glass of beer to his lips and drank in long, even swallows. He put the glass on the table and turned it with his heavy fingers. "We're going to the mountain country," Miller said. "This mountain country," Schneider said. He put his glass on the table as if the taste of the beer had suddenly become unpleasant. "Up in Colorado territory." "That's right," Miller said. "You know the country." "I know it," Schneider said. He nodded for several moments without speaking. "Well, I guess I ain't lost much time. I can get a good night's sleep and start back for Ellsworth early tomorrow morning. Miller did not speak. He took his glass up and finished his beer, and sighed deeply. Why in the hell do you figure to go clear across the country? Schneider asked. You can find plenty of buffalo 30-40 miles from here. Summer hides, Miller said. Thin as paper and just about as strong. Schneider snorted. What the hell do you care? You can get good money for them. Fred, Miller said, we've worked together before. I wouldn't lead you into something that wasn't good. I got a herd staked out. Nobody knows anything about it except me. We can get back 1,000 hides easy, maybe more. You heard McDonald. $4 a piece for prime hides. That's $4,000. $600 for your share, maybe more. That's a damn sight better than you'll do anywhere else around here. Schneider nodded. If there's buffalo where you say there is, how long has it been since you've seen this herd? It's been some time, Miller said, but that don't worry me. It worries me, said Schneider. I know for a fact you ain't been in the mountain country for 8-9 years, maybe longer. Charlie's going, Miller said, and Mr. Andrews here is going. He even put up the money. Charlie will do anything you tell him to, Schneider said. And I don't know Mr. Andrews. I won't argue with you, Fred. Miller poured himself another glass of beer. But it seems like you're letting me down. You can find another Skinner who ain't got as much sense as I have. You're the best there is, Miller said. And for this trip, I wanted the best. Hell, Schneider said. He reached for the pitcher of beer. It was almost empty. He held it up and called to Francine. Francine got up from the table where she was sitting, took the pitcher, and left without speaking. Schneider took the bottle of whiskey from in front of Charlie Hoge and poured several fingers of it into his beer glass. He drank it in 2 gulps, grimacing at the burning. It's too much of a gamble, he said. We'd be gone 2 months, maybe 3, and we might have nothing to show for it. It's been a long time since you've seen them buffalo. A country can change in 8 or 9 years. We won't be gone for more than a month and a half, or 2 months, Miller said. I got fresh young oxen. They should make near 30 miles a day going, and maybe 20 coming back. They might make 15 going and 10 coming, if you push them right hard. The days are long this time of year, Miller said. The country's nearly level right up to where we're going, and there's water all along the way. Hell, Schneider said. Miller did not speak. All right, Schneider said. I'll go, but no shares. I'm taking no chances. I'll take $60 a month straight, starting the day we leave here and ending the day we get back. That's $15 more than usual, Miller said. You said I was the best, Schneider said, and you offered shares. Besides, that's rough country where you intend to go. Miller looked at Andrews. Andrews nodded. Done, Miller said. Where's that gal with the beer? Schneider asked. Charlie Hoge took the bottle of whiskey from in front of Schneider and replenished his glass. He sipped the liquor delicately, appreciatively. His small grey eyes darted between Miller and Schneider. He grinned sharply, craftily at Schneider and said, I knowed all along you give in. I knowed it from the first. Schneider nodded. Miller always gets what he's after. They were silent. Francine came across the room with their pitcher of beer and set it on the table. She smiled briefly at the group and spoke again to Miller. You about finished with your business? Almost, Miller said. I left your package in the front room under the bar. Why don't you run out and see if it's what you wanted? Maybe you can come back a little later and have a drink with us. Francine said, all right, and started to move away. As she moved, Schneider put out a hand and laid it on her arm. Andrews stiffened. Sprechen Sie Deutsch? He asked. He was grinning. Yes, she said. Ach, he said, ich so glaube, thou arbeitest jetzt, nicht wahr? Nein, Francine said. Ja, Schneider said, still grinning. Du arbeitest mit mir, nicht wahr? All right, Miller said. We've got things to talk about. Go on now, Francine. Francine moved away from Schneider's hand and went quickly across the room. What was that all about? Asked Andrews. His voice was tight. Why, I just asked her if she wanted a little job of work, Schneider said. I ain't seen a better-looking whore since I was in St. Louis. Andrews looked at him for a moment. His lips tingled with anger, and his hands, beneath the table, were tightly clasped. He turned to Miller. When do we figure on leaving? 3 or 4 days, Miller said. He looked from Andrews to Schneider with faint amusement. The wagon needs a little work, and like I said, a couple of the oxen need to be shod. Nothing's going to hold us up. Schneider poured himself a glass of beer. You said there was water all the way. What route do we take? Miller smiled. Don't worry about that. I have that all figured out. I've thought it over in my mind for a long time. All right, Schneider said. Do I work alone? Mr. Andrews will help you. He ever done any skinning before? He looked at Andrews, grinning again. No, Andrews said shortly. His face grew warmer. I'd feel better about it if I worked with somebody I knew better, Schneider said. No offense. I think you'll find that Mr. Andrews will be a lot of help, Fred. Miller's voice was gentle, and he did not look at Schneider. All right, Schneider said. You're the boss, but I ain't got any extra knives. All of that's taken care of, Miller said. All we need is to get Will some work clothes. We can do that tomorrow. You've got it all figured out, haven't you? Schneider spoke indifferently. The sleepy look had come back into his pale eyes. Miller nodded. Andrews finished the last dregs of his warm beer. I take it, then, that there's nothing else we have to talk about tonight? Nothing that won't keep, Miller said. Then I think I'll go back to the hotel. I have a few letters I ought to write. All right, Will, Miller said. But we ought to get those clothes tomorrow. Why don't you meet me at the dry goods store just after noon? Andrews nodded. He said good night to Charlie Hodge and laid a bill on the table. I'd be obliged if you'd all have another drink on me. He walked across the room, through the door into the smoky bar, and quickly onto the street. The anger which had risen within him back in the room, listening to Schneider talk to Francine, began to subside. A light breeze came in from the river and carried with it the odor of manure and the acrid smell of heated, impure metal from the blacksmith shop across the street from him. A red glow from the shop filtered through the yellow light of a lantern hung within the doorway. The soft whoosh of bellows working could be heard among the clangs of metal on hot metal. He breathed deeply of the cooling night air and started off the board sidewalk to cross the street to his hotel. But he halted, with one foot in the dust of the street and the other still resting on the edge of a thick plank. He had heard, or thought he had heard, his name whispered behind him, somewhere in the darkness. He turned uncertainly, and heard more distinctly the voice that called to him. Mr. Andrews, over here. The whispered voice seemed to come from one corner of the long saloon building. He went toward it, his way lighted by the irregular glow that came from the half door and the small high windows of Jackson's saloon. It was Francine. Though he had not expected to see her, he looked at her without surprise. She stood on the first step of the long, steep stairway that led up the side of the building. Her face was made pale and vague by the darkness, and her body was a dark shadow in the darkness around her. She reached out her hand and laid it on his shoulder. On the step, she stood above him and looked down at him when she spoke. I thought that was you. I've been waiting here for you to come out. Andrew's voice came with difficulty. I got tired of talking to them. I needed some fresh air. She smiled and drew back a little, her hand still light on his shoulder. Her face fell into shadow, and he could see only her eyes and her teeth, revealed by her smiling in the reflection of dim light. Come upstairs with me, she said softly. Come up for a while. He swallowed and tried to speak. Come on, she said. It'll be all right. She exerted a gentle pressure on his shoulder and turned away from him. He heard the rustle of her clothes as she started up the stairs. He followed, groping for the rough handrail on his left, his eyes desperately trying to make out the shape that went softly and slowly above him, pulling him with her invisibly. They paused at the small square landing at the top of the stairs. She stood in the dark shade of the doorway, fumbling with the latch. For an instant, Andrews looked out over Butcher's Crossing. What he could see of the town was a dark, irregular shadow like a blotch upon the glimmer of the plain. The thin edge of a new moon hung in the west. The door creaked open. Francine whispered something, and he followed her into the darkness of the doorway. A small dim light burned in the distance. Its illumination was thin and local, but he could make out that they were in a narrow hall. The muffled sounds of men's voices and the clump of boots on wood came from below. He realized that they were just above the large hall beside Jackson's saloon, out of which he had walked a few moments before. He groped forward, and his hands touched the smooth, stiff material of Francine's dress. "Here," she whispered. She found his hand and took it. Her hand felt cool and moist to his own. "Down this way." He went blindly after her, his feet sliding and catching on the rough boards of the floor. They stopped. Dimly he made out a doorway. Francine opened the door, saying, "This is my room," and went in. Andrews followed, blinking against the light that came when the door was open. Inside the room, he closed the door and leaned against it, his eyes following Francine, who moved across the small room to a table, upon which a lamp, its base milk-white and decorated with brightly painted roses, burned dimly. She turned the lamp up so that the room was more brightly illumined. The light revealed the smallness of the room, the neatly made iron bedstead, a small curving sofa whose wooden frame was carved with twinned flowers, and upon which were cushions covered with dark red velvet. The walls of the room were newly papered. Upon them hung several framed engravings of woodland scenes. Here and there on the walls the brightly flowered wallpaper curled and peeled, revealing naked wood. Though he did not know what he had expected, Andrews was taken aback and made slightly uncomfortable by the familiarity of the room. For a moment he did not move. Francine, her back to the light, was smiling. Again he was aware of the light glinting from her eyes and teeth. She motioned to the couch. Andrews nodded and went across the floor. When he sat down, he looked at his feet. There was a thin carpet, worn and stained, over the floor. Francine came across the room from the table beside the bed and sat on the couch beside him. She sat a little sideways so that she was facing him. Her back was straight, and she looked almost prim there in the lamplight, with her hands folded in her lap. You have a nice place here," Andrew said. She nodded. "I have the only carpet in town," she said. "I had it sent from St. Louis. Pretty soon I'm going to get a glass window. The dust blows in, and it's hard to keep a place clean." Andrews nodded and smiled. He drummed his fingers on his knees. "Have you been here long, in Butcher's Crossing?" 2 years, she said indifferently. "I was in St. Louis before that, but there were too many girls there. I didn't like it." Her eyes were upon him as if she had no interest in what she was saying. "I like it here. I can rest in the summer, and there aren't so many people." He spoke to her, but he hardly knew what he said, for as he spoke, his heart went out to her in an excess of pity. He saw her as a poor, ignorant victim of her time and place, betrayed by certain artificialities of conduct, thrust from a great mechanical world upon this bare plateau of existence that fronted the wilderness. He thought of Schneider, who had caught her arm and spoken coarsely to her, and he imagined vaguely the humiliations she had schooled herself to endure. A revulsion against the world rose up within him, and he could taste it in his throat. Impulsively, he reached across the sofa and took her hand. "It must be a terrible life for you," he said suddenly. "Terrible?" She frowned thoughtfully. "No, It's better than St. Louis. The men are better. There aren't so many girls. You have no family, no one you can go to. She laughed. What would I do with a family? She squeezed his hand and raised it and turned it palm upward. So soft, she said. She caressed his palm with her thumb, which moved slowly and rhythmically in small circles. That's the only thing I don't like about the men here. Their hands are so rough. He was trembling. With his free hand, he grasped the armrest of the sofa and held it tightly. What do they call you? Francine asked softly. Is it William? Will, Andrew said. I'll call you William, she said. It's more like you, I think. She smiled slowly at him. You're very young, I think. He removed his hand from the smooth caress of her fingers. I am 23. She came closer to him, sliding across the sofa. The rustle of her stiff, smooth dress sounded like soft cloth tearing, her shoulder lightly pressed against his shoulder, and she breathed gently, evenly. Don't be angry, she said. I'm glad you're young. I want you to be young. All of the men here are old and hard. I want you to be soft while you can be. When will you go with Miller and the others? 3 or 4 days, Andrew said, but we will be back within the month, and then... Francine shook her head, though she continued smiling. Yes, you'll be back, but you won't be the same. You'll not be so young. You will become like the others. Andrew looked at her confusedly, and in his confusion cried, I will only become myself. She continued as if he had not interrupted. The wind and the sun will harden your face. Your hands will no longer be soft. Andrews opened his mouth to reply. He had become vaguely angry at her words, but he did not speak his anger, and as he looked at her in the lamplight, his anger died. There was a simplicity and earnestness, a sweet but not profound sorrow in her expression, which disarmed him, and which raised a tenderness with the pity he had felt a moment earlier. At that instant it seemed to him incredible that she could be what her profession termed her. He extended the hand that he had withdrawn, and covered her hand. You are, he began, and hesitated, and began again. You are, but he could not finish. He did not know what he wanted to say. But for a little while, Francine said, you will be here. For 3 or 4 days, you will be young and soft. Yes, Andrew said. You will stay here for these days, Francine said softly. She ran her fingertips lightly over the back of his hand. You will make love to me. He did not speak. He was aware of her fingers moving upon his hand, and he concentrated upon that sensation. I'm not working now, Francine said quickly. It's for love. It's because I want you. He shook his head numbly, not in refusal, but in despair. Francine, I know, she said softly, smiling again. You have not had a woman before, have you? He did not speak. Have you? He remembered several abortive experiments with a younger cousin of his, a small petulant girl, some years before. He remembered his urgency, his embarrassment, and his eventual boredom. And he remembered his father's averted face and vague words after the visiting parents of the girl left their home. No, he said. It's all right, Francine said. I'll show you, here. She stood up and extended her hands down to him. He grasped them and stood up before her. She came close to him, almost touching him. He felt her soft stomach come against him. His muscles contracted, and he flinched slightly away. It's all right, Francine said, her breath warm against his ear. Don't think of anything. She laughed softly. Are you all right? Yes, he said shakily. She pulled away from him a little and looked at his face. It seemed to him that her lips had grown thicker and that her eyes had darkened. She moved her body against him. I wanted you the first time I saw you, she said, without you even touching me or talking to me. She moved away, her eyes still dark upon him. She reached her arms up behind her neck and began unsnapping her dress. He watched her numbly, his arms held awkwardly at his sides. Suddenly she shook her body and the dress fell in a grey heap at her feet. She was nude. Her body gleamed in the lamplight. Delicately she stepped out of the dress, and her flesh quivered with the movement. Her heavy breasts swung slowly as she walked towards him. Now, she said, and lifted her lips up to him. He kissed her with dry lips, tasting wetness. She whispered against his lips, and her hands fumbled with his shirt front. He felt her hands go inside his shirt, go lightly over the tensed muscles of his chest. Now, she said again. It was a bruised sound, and it seemed to echo in his head. He pulled away from her a little to look at her soft, heavy body that clung to him like velvet, held there of its own nature. There was a serenity on her face, almost as if it were asleep, and he felt that she was beautiful. But suddenly there came into his mind the words that Schneider had used back in the saloon. He had said that he hadn't seen a better-looking whore since he had left St. Louis, and the look of her face changed, though he could not tell in what respect. He was assailed by the knowledge that others had seen this face as he was seeing it now, that others had kissed her on her wet lips, had heard the voice he was hearing, had felt the same breath he was feeling upon his own face now. They had quickly paid their money and had gone, and others had come, and others. He had a quick and irrational image of hundreds of men steadily streaming in and out of a room. He turned, pulled away from her, suddenly dead inside. "What is it?" Francine said sleepily. "Come back." "No," he said hoarsely, and flung himself across the room, stumbling on the edge of the rug. "My God, no, I'm sorry." He looked up. Francine stood dumbly in the center of the room. Her arms were held out as if to describe a shape to him. There was a look of bewilderment in her eyes. "I can't," he said to her, as if he were explaining something. I can't." He looked at her once more. She did not move, and the look of bewilderment did not leave her face. He pulled open the door and let the knob fly violently from his hand. He ran into the dark hall and stumbled down its length, opened the door to the landing, and stood for a moment on the landing, breathing air in deep, famished gulps. When his legs regained some of their strength, he went down the stairs, feeling his way by the rough banister. He stood for a moment on the rough sidewalk and looked up and down the street. He could not see much of Butcher's Crossing in the darkness. He looked across the street at his hotel. A dim light came from the doorway. He went across the dusty street toward it. He did not think of Francine or of what had happened in the room above Jackson's saloon. He thought of the 3 or 4 days that he would have to wait in this place before Miller and the others were ready. He thought of how he might spend them, and he wondered how he might press them into one crumpled bit of time that he could toss away.